end of the 18th century, Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin promoted the use of slaves to produce cotton, which enabled the South to control Britain since 75% of Britain's cotton came from the South. The government in antebellum South was ran by few and heavily affected by the planter aristocracy, widening the gap between the rich and poor. The South's economy was financially unstable as it became increasingly monopolistic, and plantation owners began to plunge into debt. Free blacks, otherwise known as the third race, were significantly discriminated against, as their rights were extremely limited. As slaves, blacks managed to sustain family life but were not allowed to read or get an education, since reading brought ideas and ideas brought rebellion. Abolitionists, many who were inspired by the Second Great Awakening's focus on the sin of slavery, wrote anti-slavery books such as American Slavery as It Is by Theodore Dwight Weld, and formed organizations like the American Colonization Society. William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Sojourner Truth were amongst the greatest abolitionists of slavery. Abolitionists were unpopular for a long time in the North and sought to keep the Union intact. If the debt between the South and North were to dissolve, so would the Union. The Whig Party came to power with Tyler's presidency. Many changes occurred, including financial reform, termination of the independent treasury system, and the passing of the protective Whig tariff of 1842. Hatred of Britain in the 19th century sparked the Third War with England, a small rebellion in Canada, and an attack on American ships. Conflicts with Mexico and Texas was a leading issue in the election of 1844, otherwise known as the Election for Manifest Destiny. However, President Tyler signed a resolution in 1845 that allowed Texas to become the 28th state in America. When it was Polk's turn to take over presidential office, he had 4 goals in mind: a lower tariff, restoration of the independent treasury, acquisition of California, and settlement of the Oregon dispute without violence, all of which he was successful in doing. The Mexican-American War finally came to a close through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but a whole new debate emerged about the extension of slavery. The two political parties at the time, Whigs and Democrats, were lacking support from the nation. After President Polk did not attempt for a second inauguration, General Lewis Cass was nominated as the Democratic candidate, and General Zachary Taylor, the victor, was nominated by the Whigs. Anti-slavery Northerners came together and organized the Free Soil Party, nominating Martin Van Buren in the election of 1848. In that same year, gold was discovered in the state of California, leading to the California Gold Rush of 1849 and the eventual succession of the Free State to the United States. Slaves were being taken from the South to Canada through the Underground Railroad, eventually leading to a stricter fugitive slave law. In the eventful year of 1850, President Zachary Taylor passed away and Millard Fillmore took over office. Under his presidency, he passed the Compromise of 1850, which admitted California as a free state, gave Texas $10 million for lost land, and much more. Due to a split in the Whig Party, Democratic candidate Franklin Pierce won in the next election. In order to make travel to California and Oregon easier, the Transcontinental Railroad was constructed, resulting in conflict over control of the location of the railroad and ultimately the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed popular sovereignty to decide the fate of the slaveholding status of the two states. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and Hinton R. Helper's The Impending Crisis of the South were prominent in stirring up an abolitionist spirit and sparking the Civil War. Southerners were outraged as Northerners began to pour into Kansas, resulting in many Southerners voting Kansas to be a slave state. John Brown, a mentally insane man, led a group of followers in 1856 and killed 5 pro-slaveryites, in which Kansas was given the name Bleeding Kansas. By 1857, Kansas was eligible for statehood, and the status of whether or not it should be a slave state led to much conflict, splitting the Democratic Party in 2. Buchanan won the election of 1856 due to doubts about his competitor. In 1857, the Dred Scott decision denied any slave citizenship in his justification. Congress was not allowed to outlaw slavery, and that the Missouri Compromise had been unconstitutional all along. It was clear that the Supreme Court, the President, and the Constitution all supported the South, and only Congress, now banned from outlawing slavery, was in favor of the North. The Panic of 1857 erupted under Buchanan's presidency as California gold caused inflation, overspeculation led to greater farmer debt, and calls for a higher tariff were made. Abraham Lincoln was nominated as the Republican presidential candidate in the election of 1860, leading to the succession of South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. However, in the next year, a civil war would break out, leading to much bloodshed and the controversy over the topic of slavery. When President Lincoln was elected, there were only two significant forts in the South that flew the Union's flag. Lincoln adopted the middle-of-the-road solution as a result of a demand for supplies in Fort Sumter. South Carolina took Lincoln's move as an act of aggression and retaliated by firing on Fort Sumter in 1861. The South had the advantage of defending their own land and did not have to see victory in order to preserve the Confederacy. The North, on the other hand, had the advantage of a strong economy, railroad system, and a large population. Naval battles occurred in the late 1861 in the Trent Affair and the British attack on the American ship Alabama. Because Congress was not in session when the war broke out, Lincoln had to make many abrupt decisions as he strengthened the United States military, proclaimed a blockade, and suspended the habeas corpus. In 1863, Congress passed a federal draft law, which encouraged volunteers and strengthened the war effort. In order to financially support the war, the North passed higher tariffs and excise taxes, and passed the first income tax. Congress established the national banking system in 1863 to stimulate the sale of bonds in a standard banknote currency. New machinery was invented, such as mechanical reapers, which allowed for men to leave the farms to fight in the war. The South's economy and transportation was further wrecked by the North's blockade, and industrial capitalism was taking over cotton capitalism. The Union defeat at Bull Run ended Northern complacency about a quick victory. George McClellan and other early Union generals proved unable to defeat the tactically brilliant Confederate armies under General Lee. The Union naval blockade put a slow but devastating economic noose around the South. The political and diplomatic dimensions of the war became critical. In order to retain the border states, Lincoln first de-emphasized any intention to destroy slavery. But at the Battle of Antietam in 1862, Lincoln was able to prevent foreign intervention and turn the struggle into a war against slavery. Blacks and abolitionists joined enthusiastically in a war for emancipation, but white resentment in part of the North created political problems for Lincoln. The Union victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg finally turned the military tide against the South. Southern resistance remained strong, but the Union victories at Atlanta and Mobile assured Lincoln's success in the election of 1864 and ended the last Confederate hopes. The war ended the issues of disunion and slavery, but at a tremendous cost to both the North and the South. With the Civil War over, the nation faced the difficult problems of rebuilding the South, assisting the freed slaves, reintegrating the Southern states into the Union, and deciding who would direct the Reconstruction process. The South was economically devastated and socially revolutionized by emancipation. As slave owners reluctantly confronted the end of slave labor, blacks took their first steps into freedom. Black churches and freedmen's schools helped the former slaves begin to shape their own destiny. The new president, Andrew Johnson, was politically inept and personally contentious. His attempt to implement a modern plan of Reconstruction, along the lines originally suggested by Lincoln, fell victim to Southern whites' severe treatment of blacks and his own political blunders. Republicans imposed harsh military reconstruction on the South after their gains in the 1866 congressional elections. The Southern states re-entered the Union with new radical governments, which rested partly on the newly enfranchised blacks, but also had support from some sectors of Southern society. These regimes were sometimes corrupt, but also implemented important reforms. The divisions between moderate and radical Republicans meant that Reconstruction's aims were often limited and confused despite the important 14th and 15th Amendments. Embittered whites hated the radical governments and mobilized reactionary terrorist organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan to restore white supremacy. Congress impeached Johnson but failed to convict him. In the end, the poorly conceived Reconstruction policy failed disastrously.